This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Acts chapter 27, verses 14 to 26. It's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on August 31, 2025. It's part of our series called Water and Spirit. It's about peace in the midst of an ever-changing world. So let's hear the text from the 2020 revision of the New American Standard Bible. I'll begin at Acts chapter 27, verse 14. But before very long, a violent wind called the Euraquilo rushed down from the land, and when the ship was caught in it and could not head up into the wind, we gave up and let ourselves be driven by the wind. Running under the shelter of a small island called Cauda, we were able to get the ship's boat under control only with difficulty. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, and fearing they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor and let themselves be driven along in this way. The next day, as we were being violently tossed by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. No small storm was assailing us, and from then on, all hope of our being saved was slowly abandoned. When many had lost their appetites, Paul then stood among them and said, "Men, you should have followed my advice and have not set sail from Crete, and thereby spared yourselves this damage and loss. And yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong, whom I also serve, came to me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has graciously granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island.'" This week's episode of Passages is going to deviate from its normal form. Normally, Passages is strictly about the text that I read. But for this particular episode of Passages, we're going to be covering the entire part of Acts chapter 27, not just these verses in the middle. We're going to look at this whole chapter because it is going to tell us a complete story. There will be a focus on the text read just now, but it really only contains part of the story. Sometimes for Sunday worship, for example, we read a smaller section of a text in worship because to read the entire text in worship, like all of Acts 27, would take up a lot of time. And so we read a shorter portion of the scripture, even though we may talk about a larger part of the story. Now, in this instance, Paul has been, at the opening of Acts 27, imprisoned in Jerusalem and then eventually transferred to Caesarea Maritima for nearly 2 years under a false accusation. Well, after he's been cooling his heels in jail, and this may be a combination of house arrest or some other kind of restriction, it may not be in a cell, he goes through the process of making 2 different appeals to Roman prefects or governors. The first is named Felix and the other is named Festus. They were successors to the person you might remember from the Gospels, Pontius Pilate. Well, after his patience had worn thin for a couple of years, Paul decides to tell the Roman governor that he makes his appeal to Caesar, which is his right as a Roman citizen. Any Roman citizen who felt as though they were not being treated fairly by the local governor or magistrate could make an appeal to Caesar so that their case might be heard there. Well, what this means then is that Paul's going to need to make his way to Rome via a ship at sea. He could certainly travel by land, but it would take a much, much longer amount of time than it would be if he just went by sea. And so Paul, along with some other prisoners, is turned over to a Roman centurion, and the text tells us his name is Julius. And this is where the story in Acts 27 begins. Paul is taken by ship up the Mediterranean coast. This is the east coast of the Mediterranean where Palestine and Israel are today. And they travel north along that coast, and their destination is Myra, which is the sister port to Alexandria in Egypt. Now, most of the grain in the Roman world was grown in Egypt. And so once ships in Egypt were loaded with this grain, they would travel north to Myra. In Myra, the grain would then either be transferred, or if the ship was large enough, it would stay on that ship there before it would then begin making its journey over to Rome. They just didn't sail straight across the Mediterranean to Rome. That was considered, even in this day, just a little too treacherous. And so oftentimes people would follow the sea close to land in order to get there, and that was the case in this instance as well. Now, you can still go to Myra today along the southern coast of what is Turkey, and you can see the granary that's there that was built by the Romans. So it was a transfer station for the grain coming from Egypt to get to Rome. And you might also know another famous individual from Myra, St. Nicholas, who came several centuries later, is also from this same location of Myra. Well, once Paul takes the journey on a much smaller ship to Myra, his centurion Julius transfers him and the other prisoners to a much larger ship there that is bound for Rome. And so the ship has passengers on it, we'll later learn 276 of them, and Egyptian wheat. And they set sail. And as they traveled along, they left and went across the south shore of the island of Crete. Crete is a long island in the middle of the Mediterranean. And they traveled on the south side of the island because the dominant winds during that time of year would come from the north or the east. And so they wanted to take shelter from the wind by traveling along the leeward side of the island. Even still, it wasn't a very easy trip. A lot of rough weather. It was in the fall of the year 59 BCE. And they finally stopped at a place along the southern coast of Crete called Fair Havens. The trouble they had at Fair Havens is that they realized that the seafaring was going to be difficult, but you couldn't winter there in Fair Havens. It was not a port that was particularly well protected, and so you wouldn't spend the winter there. Now, typically speaking, in the Mediterranean, ships did not sail during the winter months in this period of Roman history. There would be some occasional ships that would make that journey. Military ships would. There'd be a couple of other types that might, but a ship of this kind would not. It's just not ideal. So once they're at Fair Havens, they can't really stay there because it's not the best port. So after some time of deliberation, and then Luke tells us in Acts 27 that the fast was over, and the fast he's referring to is the fast that comes during the Jewish high holidays, during Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. So that fast of Yom Kippur is over. So that tells us it's probably late October now. And so Paul, it says in the story, told the captain and crew and even his centurion Julius to stay put. They should not leave. It's going to be difficult if they do. And so it's this latter part of October that really helps Paul understand this is not a good time for us to make our way any further. Paul says that the ship, its cargo, and even the passengers' lives were at stake if they left. Well, a majority disagreed, and they decided to try to move further along the coast of Crete to find a better port to winter in. And this all happens in Acts 27, verses 1 to 13. And in that passage, you read about what happens. They believed that they could weather the winter better in another port along the south side of the island of Crete. And it was a port city called Phoenix. But the problem is things kind of went sideways there for them. Well, literally. But before we get there, let's just stop and take a look at a key passageway for us. And it's this, that God's movement is usually only seen in hindsight. God's movement is usually only seen in hindsight. We know that the rest of this story and this chapter will tell us what happens in this incomplete episode, but for what it's worth, just so you know, this story is the most detailed story in all of the ancient world, not just in the Bible, but in all of the ancient world of a nautical journey and shipwreck. So this story in Acts 27 serves as an important piece in Greek Roman classic literature, right from the Bible. There's no other detailed story quite as clear as this one that Luke writes. Paul can foresee in the story that the journey is going to be hard, perhaps even impossible, threatening the lives of the passengers on the ship. But even he cannot see what the Spirit will do as we explore the rest of this chapter. You know, since we, in our own lives, usually see the hand of God in hindsight, then our choices in the moment we're in are simple. Do we trust God or not? Will we place our faith in God in whatever situation we face or not? Is God at work even in hardship? Even when we cannot see it yet, is God doing something? And oftentimes we'll see that in hindsight, but it's hard at times to see it in the moment. And so this notion of trusting in God and placing our faith in God is exactly what we're called to hold on to, especially in these difficult moments. Now turn our attention to the center of this chapter, which is the text that I read a few moments ago in verses 14 to 26. And this is about the messages of hope that come forth in the midst of this story. So no sooner do they set out from Fair Havens on the south side of Crete trying to get to Phoenix, their trip is interrupted. You know, Phoenix is a better port to winter in, and they're trying to get there. So as they're sailing kind of due west along the south side of Crete, a strong wind descended down upon them. Crete has a mountain on it of 9,000 feet tall, and the wind would sometimes come down that mountain and would be amplified or accelerated as it blew down to the shore. Anyone on the south side of the island, Luke calls it a Euroquilo. And it's just basically a transliteration of the Greek words there. It just means an east-northeast wind, just like the winds we might experience here in the western part of the United States. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, sometimes we get strong winds that blow off the Cascades. In Southern California, they get very strong winds blowing off the mountains there called the Santa Anas. If you live in Santa Barbara, there's mountains right up next to that seaside town, and sometimes winds blow right down those mountains out to the ocean. Those are called the sundowners. So we're familiar with this phenomenon of what it's like to have wind blowing down a mountain toward the shore. Well, this wind was so strong that it pushed the ship sideways. So they're traveling west, but the wind came from the north and the east, and it blew the ship away from the shoreline of Crete. So no matter how much they kept trying to go west, they simply could not get to Phoenix. Instead, the story tells us that they're blown to the southwest out into the open Mediterranean Sea, a path that no seafarer would have taken. No landmarks, difficult. You would have to use navigation using stars and the sun to figure out what direction you need to be going. Very difficult to do. Well, they continued to be blown by the wind, and as they were blown to the southwest, they risked running aground off the shore of Africa. That means they would have been blown almost all the way across the Mediterranean Sea. And they were worried that they would crash into a very well-known sand belt that's well offshore called Syrtis. And so they didn't want to run into that sandy bottom that would ground the ship, miles from shore. So they dropped their sea anchor and tried to stop if they could. And they even brought aboard a small craft. Usually these sailing boats would pull a dinghy behind them. They brought that small craft on board and then threw the anchors out to try to slow the ship down as it kept drifting toward this sand belt. Well, Luke tells us the storm keeps tossing them, and by day 3, after being blown off course near Crete by these winds, They begin on day 2 throwing their cargo overboard. On day 3, they start throwing tackle overboard. And in this case, it's a sailing ship. So the tackle they're throwing overboard is their extra tackle. So they would put on the ship extra items, pulleys and ropes and various things that if something were to break on the ship, they could replace it. All of that extra stuff they threw overboard because they're trying to lift the ship out of the water as much as they can by reducing its weight. Now, as you read this story, you also want to keep the story of Jonah in the back of your mind. You know, Jonah, of course, running away from God's call, boarded a ship in Joppa, went out into the Mediterranean Sea, and there was a great storm that came upon them because Jonah was on the ship. The storm in that case came because Jonah was avoiding the call of God. In this story, we're going to learn in a moment that what is happening here is happening in the opposite fashion because Paul is following the call of God. But let's just keep going for a moment. It says in the text that the clouds obscured the stars and the sun. So it's cloudy. People can't see anything. And so they were losing hope they would survive. And it makes sense why. There's now no land in sight, and they can't navigate by the stars or the rising or setting of the sun. So they don't know what direction anything. There are no compasses at this time in the ancient world. So by verse 21, the text tells us that everybody's lost their appetite. Well, no wonder they've all lost their appetite. They've been tossed around. They're all seasick. It's not a pretty picture. And it's in the middle of that Paul stands up and he says to everybody on the ship, which we'll learn a little bit later is 276 people. He stands up and he says, first, I told you so. Of course, this is classic Paul. So he tells everyone, I told you not to leave Crete, but you did anyways. Then he gets to the point. He says, keep up your courage. He then tells them there'll be no loss of life, but only the ship that will be lost. And then he recounts to them a story that's the basis for why he believes these things. He tells all the passengers on the ship, he witnesses to them about how an angel of the Lord appeared to him. And the angel of the Lord said that, Paul, do not be afraid. And then the angel goes on to say that you must stand before Caesar. And so if Paul's to stand before Caesar, he has to survive this. And the angel says that all those sailing with him would survive as well. So then Paul turns back to the crowd again after recounting this version of his angelic vision, and he tells them, keep up your courage. In other words, don't lose hope. And then he tells them he believes that God will do exactly what he says. And then he delivers one little last piece of bad news, that we're going to have to run aground on a certain island. So what Paul knows is that he believes he's going to survive this. He's telling everyone else they're going to survive, but they're not going to survive easily or without hardship. And that opens a key passageway to us here, that God brings the word of hope just in time. God brings the word of hope just in time. It's at perhaps the most hopeless moment that God moves and works. One might even wonder if God is just good at brinksmanship. You know, perhaps the opportunity for faith and hope is the most ripe in desperate moments. I wonder if Paul was carrying his own doubts about what would happen before the angel appeared to him. You know, that's back to that hindsight issue. Have you ever seen or experienced God moving or speaking just in time? Paul's hopeful encouragement at this moment must seem like the words of some kind of crazed fanatic. I mean, the doom is clear. They're throwing stuff over the side of the ship. It's a terrible storm. It's cloudy. They can't see the stars, can't see the sun. They can't see land. They don't know where they are. This is what disasters are made of. And this is exactly when God moves, when God's power has the most potency for witness. And so we turn to the rest of this text in verses 27 to 44 that conclude Acts 27. It says that Paul offers these words of encouragement and hope at the end of day 3. Well, fast forward to day 14, 11 days later. Now, Luke has been traveling with them, so he's on the ship as well, and that's why this story is written in such detail, because Luke is with them. And oftentimes when you hear the story in Acts, you'll see it written in the first person, I or we, rather in the third person, he or him, or she and her, because Luke is with them, so he's writing it in almost autobiographically. And it was night in the Adriatic Sea, but they didn't know they were in the Adriatic Sea. They were somewhere south of Italy. And so they knew they were near shore because they could hear waves crashing. So they began to take measurements of the depth and could see that the ship was moving closer to shallower water. Well, the crew did something, we consider a bit nefarious. They began to drop anchors from the stern to try to slow the ship down so it wouldn't crash. But then they got in that small dinghy, and they said to everyone, we're going to go secure the anchors, but what they were really trying to do was abandon ship. So that last part's not quite true. You read the story, it says that they were going to leave everyone behind before the ship crashed, and Paul takes note of what they're going to do. He sees that they're trying to abandon ship. He tells the centurion Julius that if these guys leave, we're going to crash. And so what the centurions do is before the crew can get on the small boat to try to leave, the small boat is cut loose. They cut the ropes. And that forces the crew to stay aboard. And just before dawn, Paul encouraged everyone on the ship to eat some food. This is before the shipwreck, but it's clear they're close to land. He tells them to eat some food, and the text tells us, it infers that they haven't eaten anything in days, maybe even 14 days. He told them to eat for survival because he was confident that God would save them. So he went back to the vision he had from the angel. And then Paul does something interesting. After they make this bread, and now you know where they got the wheat from because they had a whole boatload of it, Paul took this bread, it says in the story, he gave thanks for it, he broke it, and they ate. This is language you've heard before. You've heard this language in Luke's gospel with Jesus at the Last Supper. You've heard it in the book of Acts elsewhere. You've heard it from the Apostle Paul as he describes Holy Communion in 1 Corinthians. This is very formulaic. When it's time for all 276 people on the boat to eat, they eat because Paul took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and they ate. And after they ate, in order to lighten the ship even more, they took all the grain they were carrying and they threw it overboard to raise the ship even up higher in the water so they could navigate shallower waters better. Well, during the daytime of day 14, they did not know where they were, but they could see a bay. And so they cut those anchors loose and they raised the foresail and they made a run for it. They tried to land on the beach. But on their way there's a kind of a few little offshore islands here, and they got stuck between the bay and the sea. So it's not like a breakwater. Imagine two small clusters of landmass sticking out of the water, and they couldn't see well, so they tried to navigate between them, and they got stuck. Now, you can go to this location today, and you can see it. It's been 2,000 years, but you can still see what this looks like. It's called the Bay of St. Paul. The bow was stuck, and the rear of the ship began to break apart, begins to disintegrate. And so everyone was worried that everyone was just going to jump out of the ship, so the soldiers planned to kill all the prisoners, including Paul. But the centurion stopped them, saying that we've got to get Paul to Rome. The swimmers were told to abandon ship and swim for shore, and those who couldn't, they were told to grab on to something to float with, like a piece of wood or something. And it says everyone landed safely on the shore, but the ship is totally destroyed. And what they didn't know yet, when you're going to find out in the next chapter, that they had landed on the island of Malta, which is south of the Italian coast. And all the details of that are in Acts chapter 28, what happens there. But for right now, it opens a key passageway to us. And it's this, that God's salvation is free, but is never cheap. God's salvation is free, but is never cheap. This harrowing story of Paul's shipwreck on Malta is one grounded in faith and trust while holding fear. Nothing in this story is easy. Even getting off the ship is filled with a ton of uncertainty. Paul is right. God will save every one of them. But they're only saved through some pretty serious trouble. Remember that story of Jonah? The storm at sea is caused by Jonah running from God's call. This story is about Paul turning toward his call. But turning toward his call didn't mean that we're calm seas from then on. The angel spoke to Paul at the end of before day 3, but they still had to go through 11 more days before they found their way to the Maltese shore. His actions in taking bread to eat, the proclamation of salvation, the angelic message, all of it was to speak a message about this salvation that's offered to all, but a salvation that comes in the storm, not away from it. Just a quick note for you that Passages, this podcast, is moved to a new podcasting host on the FFMC podcast. So please use your favorite podcasting app to search for FFMC, and you'll find this podcast, Passages, along with any other podcast released by First Free Methodist Church. We're going to be closing down the Passages podcast exclusively on its separate feed at the end of September. So please subscribe to the FFMC podcast right away. I also encourage you to visit our church's website at ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.